We build on our own strengths. I think everybody builds on their own strengths. If you know what you can do well, you can use that. Probably even more than that, it's essential to help people coming into the Army, to help clients to name and claim what they do well. And if we can do it for us, then we can do it for them. I don't think it's easy, not only individually, but I think also in terms of just the way social services are done. There are reasons we ignore strengths. I think some of those are historical. Sigmund Freud, who was, the father of psychiatry and influenced psychology and really all the helping things. And Freud was brilliant in lots of ways. The idea of the unconscious, that there are things that bubble up that we're not aware of, we attribute to him. But we tend to think in the images and metaphors that we use, and Freud was a surgeon by training. And it was just that idea that like a surgeon, you cut and you cut and you cut till you get to the diseased tissue and then you cut it out. And that idea of just trying to dig to the root of the problem, I think, goes back to Freud. There's also the emphasis on problem solving, which really goes back to the scientific method 100 and a few years ago. And that was you start with a problem and you define the problem, and then from there you work on other steps. So when people come in, we're looking for the problem. We're looking for the root of the problem in more than just the immediate needs. And I think it's also the case that when people come in, clients or people seeking aid do not present themselves in terms of what they do well. Some of that is the way we've socialized them. People also think that if they talk about anything that's going well in their lives, they won't get help. So they present themselves often in the worst possible ways. I think we can look for strengths, and we can look in a number of places where we can find strengths of the people who come into the programs. I think that they can be found in past coping practices. Often, when people are in crisis, they literally forget what they've done before in the past. When you ask people, have you dealt with this before? What did you do then? What worked? What worked reasonably well? What worked for a while? And in that case, what we can do is help people name and claim. Name and claim coping mechanisms, coping resources that were effective for them at some point in their lives. I think strengths can be found in social support from family and friends. There's an Irish proverb, we live in the shelter of each other. And for many families, that idea of continuous contact and communication is sustaining. It's what gets a lot of people through. When we think about the issue of homelessness, the most misfortune in society, people losing housing, does not result in people coming into shelters or social service agencies. It's family and friends that catch people, and often when they do come into shelter, it's when those resources aren't adequate. They've either burned bridges. Somebody takes you in and you steal money, and that's not going to be a long-term place. Or because the family or friends just didn't have adequate space. Camping in somebody's living room for long periods of time generally doesn't work. Or the family and friends, their lease is, you can probably stay here for a couple of days, it's okay. After that, I'm in danger of losing my housing. So people will have to leave. But in many cases, it's a grandmother, it's somebody else who's able to put people up for that period of time until things get better. The family and friends really keep people together. It's who they talk to when there are problems. And in some cases, it may be best to avoid contact with family members. A guy who was getting out of prison had trouble with alcohol and drugs, and he was going to go back and live with his mother. And the worker said, who else lives there? Well, there's a brother who's actively using and maybe doing some selling. That's probably not a good place to be living. And there are some families where the patterns aren't good. I know I'm middle class. I came from a relatively secure childhood. But the first time when I heard somebody talking about their grandmother selling drugs, I think my jaw, it didn't literally drop, but it wanted to. Because in my family, the idea of grandmother and selling drugs, they don't belong in the same sentence, right? I can't visualize that. It just doesn't work. People can also find strengths in beliefs, in religious spiritual practices. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, he stated that those who had something to live for were the ones who were much more likely to make it out of the concentration camps alive. Their beliefs about one purpose in life, people's connections with a higher power, support and sustain people. I know that my God doesn't want me always to live like this. We know that participation in faith communities leads to positive outcomes. From a purely utilitarian point of view, generally people who are connected to churches, to synagogues, to mosques, tend to do better on the whole than people who don't have those connections. Studies of inner city youth, single-parent families, poor, who go to church, who graduate at much higher rates than similar youth who aren't connected. I was talking to a woman who did social services. She grew up in an AME church in Milwaukee, and she talked about when she went off to college and she'd come back and the grandmothers, would say, I'm so proud of you, honey, I'm so proud. And sometimes they'd shake her hands and there'd be a $20 bill in her hand after she finished. And these were women who didn't have a lot. And she laughed and she said, I had to graduate from college. It was either that or I could never go back to church. There's that sense of support that often comes, and some indication that prayer and spiritual practices lead to better physical health. The research isn't as conclusive as it could be. One very good study that came out of Texas that showed that people with cancer who get world-class medical care and pray live longer and better than people who just get world-class medical care. And the difficulty, of course, is when people don't get medical care because they believe that prayer should be enough. But for a lot of people, it is a resource. So when we look at strengths, we see what we pay attention to, what we expect to find. When we look for problems and dysfunction, we'll find them. When we also look for strengths and areas of growth, we'll find those as well. The third of those things I want to look at, dignity and strengths, and also the concepts of self-determination and paternalism. Self-determination, it's an ethical principle, acknowledges people's rights to make their own decisions, determine their own course of action. Paternalism is a way of practicing that interferes with a client's wishes or freedom for his own good. And we talk about self-determination generally as an ethical principle, but most of the time it's also just good practice. Majority of people only do or do wholeheartedly the things they want to do. And forcing an individual to do something they do not want to do usually doesn't work. And besides, if a client does agree to do it and it doesn't work out, guess who gets blamed, right? Well, you told me to do that, And I think some of the work that's important, in working with folks over a period of time is what are the kinds of things you can do to help people make good choices. You can't make good choices for them. You can't, control people. I used to say when my kids were little that I know how to control my children's behavior. I just lock them in the closet. The problem is Child Protective Services generally doesn't approve very much of that. And other than that, you're really talking about how you can influence behavior. There are limits on client self-determination. When clients' actions put their own or someone else's life in jeopardy, then that's an issue that's more important than self-determination. And at the same time, people have the right to do things where injury may be minimal and may turn out to be non-existent. People have the right to take risks. But it's tough. Like in many areas, it's really gray areas.